So this is a conversation with Ronnie Chatah. He is the host of the Beirut Banyan podcast and organizer of the Walk Beirut tour. We spoke about Ronnie's experience with storytelling and his desire to maintain the memory of those we have lost, such as Samir Asir, the journalist and historian assassinated 15 years ago, and his father, Mohammed Chatah, the Lebanese diplomat who was assassinated in December of 2013. We of course touched upon the current crisis in Lebanon as well, since it has worsened beyond most predictions. So as usual, you can follow the podcast on Twitter at FireTheseTimes, and if you like what I do, please consider supporting this project with only $1 a month on Patreon on buymeacoffee.com, and you can also do so directly on PayPal if you prefer. Patreon is for monthly, PayPal is for one-offs, and Buy Me a Coffee has both options. And if you cannot donate, you can still help by reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you.
I'm Ronnie Chatah. I currently run the Beirut Banyan podcast, and whenever possible, I still run the Walk Beirut tour.
Awesome. So let's start with the podcast. You have a lot of guests. You've had quite a lot of guests, especially since the October uprising, and varied guests from all walks of life, very varied points of views, even. So taking in all of this, if you want, how long has this been? Almost 10 months on. How would you look at it now, let's say?
Well, I'll start off by saying that I think storytelling is a fantastic career. Mm-hmm. And the nice thing about storytelling is that it's such a varied career that you can do so many things with it. And I used to hate my voice. And I think the first episode I did back in July last year, the one thing that rubbed me the wrong way was my voice. And I had to overcome that big hurdle. So it's okay, everyone hates their voice. That's the initial stumbling block. But I love the medium. And I think you may agree with me. I mean, you are a podcast powerhouse to your own credit. I think this is the healthiest way of exchanging ideas.
I do.
Yeah, and I say that because there's no interruption. It's as long as you'd like it. Now, maybe there's some, preferences to certain lengths, and I started doing video as well. There's ways to kind of maybe enhance or maybe even play around with the medium. But the fact of getting an idea or several ideas across within an hour or even longer, I think that's such a good way of dealing with a crisis, because you don't want to deal with it too emotionally. You don't want to let hysteria sort of be the narrative thread. You want to be able to focus in and really explore what's at stake. And I found myself recording episodes every day, sometimes 2 a day, right when the protests started. So I wanted to make sure voices were heard and the ideas were coming through without filter, if you will. Just really letting the moment speak for itself, uninterrupted. And I've been doing it almost every day, if not every day, since then.
There is this need to document, to the way I would call it, or like other people have called it before, is bearing witness to what's going on. And I don't even know what can be done with that information necessarily. It's not that if we talk about it, we would necessarily have found the answers. But I have found, and it's not just me, of course, it would be one thing if I would just be kind of talking to guests and I'm the, only listener, and, and it ends up being kind of this therapy session that a handful of people might listen to if they want to. But I have gotten very interesting feedback, and it is really that. So the way it happened, I started about 3 months ago, and I told myself I'm going to just do as many as I can with as many interesting people as I can. He kind of push through, and then the reviews will start coming in, and then based on that I will sort of decide how to continue. Is about that, and I have found the reviews almost as interesting, if honestly sometimes even more interesting than some of the episodes. And It's not. It's because the reason why I'm saying this is because I would go into an episode sort of knowing more or less in advance what I want to talk about and so on. And reviewers, or I'm calling them reviewers, just random people who have reviewed it on Twitter or on these podcast apps or whatnot, they sometimes come at it from different angles that I didn't really think about. So I'm gonna try and continue doing more of this, and this is part of why I'm having you on as well, because as you start, you hinted at it. You are a storyteller. You enjoy doing this quite a lot, and the walking tour in Beirut. Can you talk to us a bit about that? How did that come about? And what is it about? So for people who don't know, of course, so what is it about? And if you can also include, because I know this from your previous interviews, if you can also include that last quote from Samir Osir that you would mention in your tours.
Joey, I'm going to say from the beginning, you've become a segue expert as well. I know from your earlier episodes, you always would note that. You're like, I'm not really good at the segue, but here you are. You're doing the segue. Segues, I think, are really what makes a good story. And
it only took 33 episodes.
Hey, that's not bad. That's not bad. No, okay, I'll start back. I mean, the man who inspired me to give the tour is Samir Asir. And the first 14 episodes of the podcast were in a way trying to maybe expand on the walking tour through stories. And when I started the podcast, I thought of it as one interview, one conversation, maybe one topic would feed into the next topic. And the first episode I did was with Ziad Douairi, the filmmaker. And the follow-up episode was with Ilyas Malouf, who's a train enthusiast, rail network enthusiast in Ottoman history and French Mandate. And then the third one was with Muna Al-Halla, who's the Beit Beirut urban planning architect professor at AUB. But I did each episode knowing that the next guest would link up to the previous episode. And that's how I did my tour. I tried to cover every single topic worth sharing in a 7-hour story. And that's back in 2005. And I had to put it on hold with the July War of 2006. In 2009, I brought it back to life. And there was and if you'll remember, I think it was the summer of 2009, when New York Times wrote this article about Beirut being the #1 tourist destination that summer. I started giving the tour in April that year. By the summer season, there were so many people visiting Beirut. And I think I was the only person back then giving a walking tour in Beirut. So in a way, I kind of benefited from that moment of relative stability, where there was an influx of tourists, and there were many Lebanese curious about their own history. And the reason I chose Samir Asir as the tribute is because I think there's no better storyteller in Lebanese history. I modeled the tour after his writings, after his passion, after his commitment to Lebanon's history. I mean, before politics, before anything, the man is a historian. And I'm sure you've seen it, that 600-page manual.
Yes.
It's a brick, Beirut. Yeah. And it's everything you would want to know in the city's past, everything you'd want to celebrate, and everything you would want to maybe reflect on and learn from. And when he was killed, I think my own appreciation for people like him and my own curiosity took off. That's the summer of 2005. Yeah. Now, 7 hours is very difficult on any person. And I realized, you said earlier doing a podcast and you'd be the only person listening in. I mean, I think there were some tours where you'd start off with 40 people, and at the end, you had 20 committed guests, but they looked tired. And I was doing as much as I could from the old lighthouse at the end of Bliss to Burj Hamoud and everything in between. So it was maybe exhausting. So I learned very quickly, nobody's up for 7 hours. I trimmed and I ended up with 4 hours of stories, and every stop connected to the next stop. And I'll just give you an example. I tried explaining the currency. I mean, think about it now.
Now it's insane, yeah.
Now is maybe the wrong time to try to explain the currency. But even, the average person, and even, I mean, this tour was designed really for Lebanese unaware of their past. But there were many tourists as well that were curious about the city's history. So it was a nice mix of locals and foreigners. And then trying to explain why you can use two currencies in one country, why the lira is pegged, why the central bank operates the way it does, why the governor has to be a Maronite Christian, why there are 4 vice governors, each one representing a certain confession, why this system even exists to begin with. Once you start that kind of story, you can go many different places. And I would end up in very obscure places. But I would always make sure wherever that story finished, the next story began. And that was really the tour. It was meant to deliver Beirut's history in a very entertaining, but also a digestible way. And it included architecture, it included the Civil War, it included neighborhoods that are unrecognizable today. One neighborhood in particular is Wadi Abu Jmil in the heart of Beirut, mostly inaccessible today and bulldozed regardless. But very, very determined to bring that history to life. And I think Samir Asir did that through print. He did it very well. I was trying to do it in a very amateur way, trying to do it through a walking tour, through oral narration, and through maybe an engaging way that people would not get bored. And I never did anything chronologically. I never stuck to dry facts for the sake of it. I wanted to make sure the story was there. So in a way, it was almost maybe 13 or 14 short stories, and each stop was a story. And I mean, you can go very deep when you start one issue in Lebanon. You can start with one topic and you end up in Ottoman history suddenly, or you end up in an earthquake during the Roman Empire. I mean, it's very easy to jump in. So I jumped in very deep. And the end of the tour was a tribute to Samir Asir himself. I would end the tour at the garden near Martyrs Square. And you asked me to share the quote.
Yeah.
So there, I'm actually, you know what? I know this is audio, but I think always with an audio podcast, isn't it nice to hear the background sound? I love doing that. So I'm going to take out one of the tickets. It's actually 2 quotes, but the quote I think you're referring to is the one in Arabic. It's the one that he wrote mid-April 2005, April 15, if I'm not mistaken. April 15.
Which is just less than 2 months before he was killed.
Exactly, less than 2 months, and it's the day the Syrian army is leaving Lebanon. So it's the Syrian withdrawal. And it's a long piece, but the piece appeared in An-Nahar. It's the last quote of that article. And it's عودوا للشارع أيها الرفاق تعودوا إلا الوضوح. Now, that quote has been used repeatedly during the recent protests. It reemerged because that quote is the only way forward. And he left us with that quote. And if you'd like me to translate it, I mean, I think for people listening, they'll probably understand it, but I can translate it if you'd like.
Yeah, go for it.
عودوا للشارع, it's not go to the street, it's go back to the street. Return to the street. Because in 2005, Samir Asir knew it's not a matter of just one protest or one moment or one push. You need to keep going back to the street and make sure the job is done. And this is a reflection on the March 14 protests that in his mind were already beginning to decay. That's a month later. So in other words, go back to the street. Just because the Syrian army is leaving, it doesn't mean the internal mess is fixed. Now you have to get into the real dirty work. The second part I love, it says, أيها الرفاق. Now this to me is a play on words, and it's the way he operated. Samir Asir, a leftist, historian, a Syrian, Palestinian, Lebanese with a French passport, who could write in French and Arabic, live in Ashrafiyya, and spend all of his days in Hamra. The man was, I think, everything you would want in a historian. He really was able to, he connected many dots, and I think he is a reflection of all the identities of Beirut in one. And he used this phrase, أيها الرفاق, and I think he did it deliberately. It means two things. It means dear friends, and it also means dear comrades. So comrades, join him on the streets, join Samir, protest, keep protesting. Friends, the wider public, all that are paying attention to what's happening. Show up, go back to the streets, dear friends, dear comrades, and you would see him. You would know he was there. The last part, تعود إلا الوضوح, it's a tricky one. It really means you'll return to clarity. But the clarity here, I think, is the one thing that maybe he foresaw that we would not get to the final point. In other words, the sovereignty of Lebanon. And he used the quote himself, Independence 2005. He helped deliver that quote in the months leading up to March 14 and after. He believed in it, said that sovereignty of Lebanon matters. And ta'udu ila al-waduh, you'll return to clarity once you reestablish Lebanon's sovereignty. And it's not just cosmetic. It's not the Syrian army leaving. It means rebuilding Lebanon. And I think it also means, and he probably would have, I'm sure he meant it this way, a new social pact, a new arrangement between citizens and the state. So clarity is needed. And to get to clarity, you need to protest. And to keep protesting. And don't give up. And push and push and push until this mess ends. And it's a beautiful quote. It's a short quote, but it's layered in history. That's what I like about him. He delivers a lot in one sentence.
It feels surreal to think about it today. Well, now it's July 2nd, so exactly a month ago, I released the episode with Ziad Majid,
Yes.
who I know you interviewed him as well. And Ziad, for those who don't know, I mean, I won't say much because that episode is long enough already.
It's a good one, though.
Thank you. Was friends with Samir Osir, a comrade, partner in crime kind of situation, trying to build this movement together. And as Samir sort of predicted, I suppose, then being exiled from Lebanon de facto in the case of Ziad at some point, and so on. Anyway, people can listen to the episode. But I was thinking of well, I regularly think of Samir Osir, to be honest. Part of it is, because he was assassinated. So there's always this dimension of when someone is murdered, we end up, I will just speak for myself, but we end up going through their works. Sometimes I have discovered people that I had never heard of before because they were killed. And you will see the segue actually works this way as well, because this was also the case with your father. And I remember exactly where I was that day. I was in Hamra. I was in a pub whose name I just forgot, but it's on the main street. It's one of those small alleyways near the actual alleyway, but not there. And I was with my friend Karim, and he was the bartender over there, and there was the TV, so we saw the news and everything. And he turned to me and he said, they got something along the lines of like, they got one of the last good ones. That's what he told me. And I remember this so well, because it's one of those quotes that it's such a striking thing to say, and B, at the time I didn't know who your father was. And this happened so many times in Lebanese history. And by Lebanese history, I'm 29, so I'm biased of the past 30 years, essentially, But this happened so many times. It's either something very bad happened, an assassination in these cases, or something like, let's say, momentous, like in politics. So I did not know who Michel Aoun was until Michel Aoun returned. Or like in the couple of months, there was that period where the Aouni, so his supporters, and the supporters of Samir Jaja, were sort of fighting it out a lot with these ridiculous chants, fighting each other and that kind of stuff. And I was in a school in an area, an environment where they were kind of the dominant two groups. And I just remember, I've definitely told the story already, but I remember one day, I was like, what, 2005, so I would have been 14. My mother picks me up from school. We go back home. It's very close to the school. And I ask her, it's so ridiculous. I ask her, Mom, are we with the Lebanese forces or are we with the Awniyya? And she stops the car and starts yelling at me with neither of these two. We don't, Ronnie Chatah, as we say in Arabic, like we don't deal with these, which is amazing because it's the same expression, like Ronnie Chatah mal mukhaddarat, like we don't deal with drugs. And that's how I would remember these names. And because I grew up in a household where it was really taboo to talk about these things. It was taboo to talk about politics. Our house was bombed while my mom was pregnant with me by the Syrian regime at the time. That was the whole war, quote unquote, war of liberation of Michelin at the time and whatnot.
Yeah.
And it probably, obviously, it stuck. And when the reconstruction and there was this feeling, whether rightly or wrongly, but like we can forgive the generation that really had that hope in a sense that, well, this is going to be different. This is going to be different. Some of I'm just going to say like the parents' generation, some of them went one way in re-indoctrinating their children with what we would in academia we call like sectarian historiography. So like a sectarian way of seeing the world, if you want, a sectarian interpretation of Lebanese history and regional history. Yeah. Others would take the other route, which was the case of my mother, and basically just not talk about it at all, like imposed amnesia, essentially.
Right.
And this is where my need, in a sense, to compensate for that, my need for storytelling is, in one way, to compensate for the first roughly 15, 16, 17 years of my life, essentially. And I wanted to talk about your father, and feel free to talk as much as you can. I mean, this cannot be easy. I can say this, with near certainty, I'm assuming, but forget about the day itself. I mean, you can mention it if you want, but since then, how have you been trying to share these stories? I know, for example, on the podcast that you've been sharing his interviews and lectures. I think most of them are interviews, if I'm not mistaken. Some of them in video format, others I think you would put both in video and audio format. So let me ask it this way, like, what is your intended purpose of sharing what he had to say?
I'll start by saying that I think of him as a storyteller as well. Mm-hmm. And I think if he was able to paint the picture in a very eloquent and decent way. And the last months of his life, he was regularly on radio, TV, being interviewed in Lebanon, outside of Lebanon. And he was able to show the wider picture and maybe, the nitty-gritty details that people get maybe distracted with when it comes to Lebanon. Mm-hmm. I think he was able to dismiss those and show more and more what the core problems are, and trying to get Lebanon out of its civil war state. And when I started giving the tour, and before his assassination, mm-hmm. nobody knew that I was his son. Mm-hmm. And I really mean that. And that I was walking with 50, 60 people on the streets of Beirut. All these curious types would meet me. Some of them are politicians, security guards. Some are just, people that want to sell something to the group. I mean, I had a very odd group of friends on the streets of Beirut. None of them knew. None of them knew. And that also, I think, is part of the story, that my father did not like attention. He preferred sharing his thoughts in the most accessible way, but he didn't like the celebrity status, if you will, that would come automatically with Lebanese politicians. And I think he even hesitated with that word. He didn't like to be thought of as a politician. And the truth is, he spent 9 months in the Lebanese government. He was a minister of finance for 9 months during the transition after Doha. in 2008, 2009. And I can say this because these are words he shared with me. He never wanted to be a minister. So I don't know how many Lebanese ministers would say that. Maybe there are probably some that were reluctant in that post, but of the ones that I've seen on TV and before and after, not many. And he just his storytelling capabilities, I think, was his main talent. Now, he was not a writer per se. He was not I mean, he did share his thoughts on Lebanese politics. So that is what he's most known for. But I loved my anonymity, and I loved him as well. And I loved those. He came on the tour once. He just showed up in what he thought was a disguise. It was a very, very like cheap French beret and a leather jacket. He looked more like a criminal than anything. I was actually concerned, who is this weird guy walking with us? It's him. And he once he actually got to see what I do, and I loved that moment. And it's very special for me because I always wanted him to feel comfortable walking with me on the streets of Beirut, and that became increasingly difficult as the years went by. But there was a moment that he just literally he showed up and surprised me. Since his assassination, I think my life's work, if you want to, without sounding too romantic here, but everything I do in life is a reminder of him. And it's in everything I do. The tour, I stopped it for a few years, and I couldn't handle being known in Lebanon. Something that I was never used to, and I didn't like it. I didn't like the attention. I didn't like I didn't like the pity that comes with that kind of incident, that kind of tragedy. I didn't like it.
Yeah.
So I ran away. Actually ran away to, of all places, I ran to Scotland. I thought,
we almost met there.
It's appropriate to my curiosity to the podcast world. You still, I think, hummus for thought. You still have, yeah. So I remember when you sent me an email, I kind of quickly came onto the podcast. So we maybe communicated maybe 4 years ago or so, 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, 3 years. Yeah.
So I mean, yeah, I thought I'd run away and try to figure things out without being stuck with very, very difficult thoughts in Lebanon. And I left for a few years. And I didn't set foot in Beirut. I actually did not come back. It took a while.
How long was the longest?
Almost 4 years.
Wow.
Almost 4 years, yeah. When I returned, what's crazy about Lebanon, and everyone I think has this feeling, even the worst tragedy, even if it's the most personal one, over time, you still love Lebanon. I completely I only thought of the good. And when I returned deeply missing and loving Lebanon. And there are many friends of mine that said, if anyone has the right not to return, it's you. And, you're maybe, but it's not that. I still love Lebanon. And I returned, and I thought, you know what? There's an internship starting in his name. They need funds. They need money. Let me do the tour one time. And let me try to raise money through donations for this internship. And I thought literally I would do it once, just a one-off. That one time turned into about 6 months because I didn't realize that the moment I would start doing it again, there would be people waiting. And I'm not trying to, this is not said from ego, on the contrary. I got hundreds of emails within hours just saying the tour is back. And to me, it's felt so good reconnecting with something I used to love doing regularly. It felt so good. And it also felt that it was the moment to try to share my father's story on the tour. And I deliberately decided to end the tour with Samir Asir like I did before. There was no reason to stop doing that. But in the build-up towards his stop, I wrote a eulogy of Martyrs Square, and I included his assassination in that eulogy. And I thought maybe I would share it. And it's an ode to Beirut, and it's told in second-person narrative. So I'm literally talking to Martyrs Square, where my father is buried. And I ended up sharing it as an episode on the podcast as well. It's the episode 100, Al-Barish. I wanted to make sure I did not avoid that topic. At the same time, didn't want that assassination to become the tour. I still wanted Beirut to shine in its own right, just at the same time acknowledging a very personal loss that's now part of the story. And I found a way to do it without it hurting too much. It took a few tries to kind of make sure I could do it in front of, 50 people. It's not easy to kind of open up ad hoc and start spilling your heart out. But I found a way that would not distract from the city's story. And I thought, what better way to acknowledge that loss than in the heart of the city, in Martyrs Square, right where he's buried, and now right where we're seeing history unfold once again. So to me, it was too poetic to turn down. And I honestly, I only stopped doing it again because Martyrs Square is alive at the moment. There's no need to, try to explain it. It's there. You want to see it, you go. And also it's not the right time right now to try to give the good and the bad. I think we need to wait a bit because things are moving too quickly. It's not just about COVID. It's about what we're seeing on the streets of Beirut. There's a lot of pain. There's a lot of suffering. I think it would distract to try to bring a big audience and try to kind of. I think it would feel a little phony. So I'm not doing the tour right now, but instead putting all my energy into the podcast.
It reminds me of Zaina Hashim, who was a recent guest of mine. She's a Lebanese poet.
Yes.
And she mentioned that she was unable, and she still is unable, to put the revolution in a poem. And I've experienced something similar. Part of the reason why I'm doing the podcast is also because I have been having difficulties writing it down. There was a period between roughly October and like January, February I was writing fairly frequently, long form essays or like shorter stuff or whatnot. And then I sort of had to take a break back when it felt like the entire, like so much was being on pause as well due to the pandemic. But like I have never been out of Lebanon for too long. 4 years that you mentioned, that has never happened to me. The longest I think I've ever been out of Lebanon was like maybe 4 months. And
wow,
that's besides actually the exception being right now due to the pandemic and the situation. Is I came here, I'm in Switzerland now doing my studies. I came here in January, so I've been here since then. And due to everything that's going on and other things back home in Lebanon, I may not go back before Christmas, if then. We'll see what happens by then, obviously. Which would mean almost a year without being in Lebanon, which is very weird to me. I have never not been a summer, like all of my summers were in Lebanon. And if they were not, it's been because I had some trips somewhere else, but that was because I was still living in Lebanon, so I was going back to Lebanon. And the notion that I may one day be a migrant or diaspora or all of these words sits very, very uncomfortably with me. I have nothing against these words, and there are many people who it's like feel comfortable with these categories, and that's good on them. I don't think there's anything wrong with moving from one place to another and making another place home. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. It's just that for me, there's something that has always sort of sat a bit uncomfortably, and I still don't know why. So it's still on an ongoing process of trying to figure out why. Part of the reason I think is because there are multiple identities in my family. That Lebanon was actually the the um, the thing that brought all of these identities together. So
Mm.
Palestinian, Italian, Argentinian, French, Swiss. Um, all of my families are kind of like like many Lebanese, of course, a bit everywhere. In my case, sorry, it's not just like second, third generation Lebanese who went to Argentina, then came back, and so on. It's like one. My grandmother's Italian, her husband who passed away recently was Palestinian, and so on and so forth. And so I kind of grew up with that, and not really knowing what to do with it, other than through the lens of, well, I'm still Lebanese first. That's what it was growing up. And later on in my 20s, whatnot, at some point I started accepting these identities a bit more. So I started welcoming, if you want, complexity much more than I did growing up. Growing up, it was just no questions asked. I'm Lebanese and that's it. There's no big deal about it, but that's it. I didn't really make too much of a fuss over the fact that I have a Palestinian grandfather, which of
Right.
course is a big deal in Lebanon, and something that um, I later understood that this was a big deal and it had to be talked about. You shouldn't be hiding it because it would be easier. It's easier to hide it for the reasons that we all know, because in Lebanon it's very difficult to be Palestinian, and it's that is why, among other reasons, that I had felt this connection with Samir Asir. His multiple identities, choosing to speak as Lebanese without renouncing his Palestinianness or his Syrianness.
Right.
This is something that I have found very appealing and like just very uncommon, like at best, in my experience, from what I've seen, at best we might have people who identify as Lebanese Americans, Lebanese French, Lebanese, usually a Western nationality, or maybe Latin American nationality, or even West African in some cases as well. And that would be a different kind of dynamic. Not that one is better than the other, but it would be a different kind of dynamic that didn't really need much explanation in Lebanon. So if you're like half Lebanese, half Dutch, no one is really gonna give you shit for it in Lebanon. Whereas if you have a Palestinian parent and the other parent is Syrian, as was the case with Samir Asir, then that had to matter somehow. And I think what he did with that, because you can do with multiple identities, you can take them in different ways. You can erase them. You can, my grandfather, the Palestinian, actually erased his Palestinian identity. He just called himself Lebanese.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can do something with them, which is what Samir Assi tried to do. He kept on being active with the Palestinian cause. He kept on being active with the Syrian cause against the Assad regime, while also being active with the Lebanese cause. And it's that trifecta, if you want, the fact that he was able to do all three at the same time, that I have personally found very appealing. It doesn't mean that I romanticize the man. He was a great intellectual writer whose time came too soon, and that's just what it is. He did not have to be a martyr. Like he did not have to die for something greater to happen. It just happened, and it's horrible that it happened. And I'm trying to learn from what he had to say, and maybe even disagree with him on some things. It hasn't happened yet, amazingly, but I'm sure if I dig deep enough, there will be some things that I disagree with, because like, why not? At some point, disagreements are not necessarily a bad thing. So I was rambling a bit, but
No, on the
um,
contrary. I mean, a lot of what you said resonates with me and the way I read him. I mean, I'll add only one thing. I think your own story, your
mhm,
own multi-layered family, and
mhm,
it's not like, I mean, the Palestinian part is not, if anything, Lebanese Dutch should be more bizarre than Lebanese Palestinian,
yeah, exactly.
right? I mean, it's literally just a few kilometers away, and it's not like you're searching for something so fantastical. It's Palestine. It's literally next door. So that the fact that being Palestinian has so much weight on it, I think, and the way I read Samir Asir, the way I read people the way I read any historian who's able to uh, give the sort of the wider lens, is that regional wars, in particular in our neighborhood, it forced identities on us.
Yes.
Yeah, and this is something that I think is beyond any person's control. A Palestinian becomes something more than a Palestinian. Even the word Lebanese becomes controversial. Syrian today has its own weight, and every country in our neighborhood, but in particular the neighboring countries, I think it didn't just tear us apart, it made us into things that we weren't. And I read his books that way. And also, to take it one step further, not just regional war, but civil war, I think, is what forced people like you and me and the generation before us and even the generation before that one, and maybe the current one as well, to abandon the country. Not because we don't love Lebanon, it's because we can't survive any longer in Lebanon. And I completely agree with you. I don't like the term diaspora. It's not something that I would judge upon anyone else. But for me, I don't want to feel disconnected. On the contrary, I don't really want to move on from the country. I actually want to be fully entrenched in everything that happens. And I think we never moved from the Civil War.
Yeah.
And I'm going to say this in a very broad way. It's not that we didn't move from 15 years of fighting. We did. The guns, for the most part, the guns fell silent. For the most part, not all, but for the most part.
For the most part.
Yeah, most militiamen that fought in the Civil War, most of them went home. But that's not how you end a civil war. Civil war, I mean, it takes a lot of work to take a country from civil war to something better. Somehow, we managed to take the country to something worse. And that is what killed the people like Samir Asir. And I'm saying this in a very broad sense. That is what also I would add my father to that story, and I would add any warlike tragedy following the Civil War is, I think, inappropriately described because it is still the Civil War. And I think that is the challenge Samir Asir left us with. I think he wanted us to literally move on from the Civil War. In 2020, 30 years since Ta'if, 31 years since Ta'if, we are still dealing with Civil War issues.
Yes.
And that, I think, will always plague us with the identity problems, that will always give us excuses not to try harder, that will also maybe give us reasons to blame certain groups. And I think that is the ultimate tragedy. That's why my Arabic is not perfect. That's why my Lebanese dialect is not perfect. I grew up in the US as a kid, not because my parents wanted to run away from the country. On the contrary, my parents actually stuck it out until things got too violent, and then they left. And many people like them, and hundreds of thousands of Lebanese. We have millions in the diaspora that just felt that they couldn't survive at home. But I think very few were eager to run away. I think for the most part, they left knowing that things were too difficult, but they didn't leave because they really wanted to leave. And unfortunately, those that stayed and tried to move the country beyond Civil War era, they ultimately were killed. If they were not killed, they ran away out of fear. And we know some of these people that they just they had to leave out of concern for their own family. They ran away. That's not how you transition a country from civil war to something better. So that's the core issue. And in the episodes you mentioned, I try every now and then I will reread a blog post that my father wrote. And I wasn't really aware that he was writing these things. And to be honest, I don't think anyone knew. He just would go on Blogspot, and he was having these, some of them are tantrums, they're not like, they're all in draft form, and there's mistakes in them. I think he probably was up at 4 a.m. and just maybe writing something and would just, close his laptop. I think it was at that level. But there are some blogs and I think they expand in a very different way. They expand on Samir Asir's own thought process, and I reread them and I share them on the podcast now and then, and they all harken back to the core issues that we have not solved. And I think they're more pressing today than they were 10 years ago. And the longer we ignore them, the higher the chances are that the Lebanon we know will not be with us much longer. So I do my best in my limited capacity to share those words whenever possible.
You know, I'm here because I'm studying Lebanon. It's a bit of a paradox, but my PhD is on post-war Lebanon, specifically Lebanese cinema, and it's not about cinema itself. It's more like the themes that are discussed in cinema, and so I start analyzing the themes. And what's extraordinary to me is that some of the things that we are seeing today expressed, like the anxieties that people are expressing online in Arabic, in English, some in French. Some of these were already sort of manifested in movies before. The fear of, I believe it's still my cover photo right now. I keep on changing it, but I think it's if it is that cover photo, it's from a scene from Waves 98 by Elie Derer, which is this short film, and he released it just a few months before the 2015 movement, the Youth Think movement, if I'm not mistaken. And anyway, in that it's an intergenerational trauma, if you want, being played out in, it's about 18 minutes, I think, or something like that. And there's a scene where he says, "I don't want to end up like them."
Right.
And he's talking about his parents, who in the short film, you see them sort of sitting in front of the TV, just watching the news, and sort of like, as we've come to associate many of that generation, unfortunately, usually, I mean, because they have survived the war, and so there's a lot of trauma that has not been dealt with, among other things. And other things like, we're all going to leave, Lebanon is going to drown in trash, which was obviously the theme of 2015, but that now it's like it's going to drown in everything else, and the politicians are going to leave as soon as the airport opens with the monies and everything. That's basically the plot of another short movie called Submarine, in which Lebanon is basically dead, like disease has taken over, and people are trying to leave by boat because politicians have already escaped by plane or helicopters or whatnot. Anyway, so the point is that we have these post-war films. You know, I just listed two. I look at roughly 20 or so of them. And these films talk about themes that, if this was the post-war, if this was really something that was post a war, okay, you will have some things that are unresolved. You know, you will have some tensions here and there. Probably no peace will ever be perfect, but you wouldn't have every single symptom that created the war in the first place, or that was developed during the war. You wouldn't have them again in the post-war, and also sometimes even worse than during the Civil War. And
exactly. Yeah.
This is why the concept of Lebanon being a post-war society is actually a bit misleading. They just, as you said, the guns fell silent. For the most part, they don't shoot at each other. That's a good thing. I don't want them to start shooting at each other. It's not a good thing if they start doing that. But that doesn't mean that the Civil War mentality or the Civil War framework, that doesn't mean that has ended. And that is really the problem. And so I end up worried a lot that these hauntings, essentially, and haunting is a very, very overwhelming symbol in many post-war Lebanese films. I'm using post-war in quotation, of course. That just keeps on coming back and back. So all of these questions, the issue of the waste crisis in 2015, the ongoing corruption, the post-October development, the hyperinflation now that we're witnessing, of like we're losing track of how things, it's just deteriorating in such a pace. And I'm sitting here in Switzerland, looking at all of this, trying to speak to my mom and grandmother and some friends here and there as much as I can, of course. But there's something very, very odd about this moment right now.
I want to add something here, Joey, and I'm glad you mentioned the this haunting visual of every of these kinds of. My memory of Lebanon during the Civil War is Tripoli in the 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
And Tripoli, for the most part, and I mean, I was a boy, 7, 8 years old, visiting from the States, unable to get to Tripoli from Beirut. So this is Khat Tamas, this is divided Lebanon. We'd have to fly to Syria, to Damascus, and then take a very, very long taxi journey to Tripoli, only to see relatives. But I'm younger. These are not very clear memories, but I do remember a city where, for the most part, the Civil War had ended. People would go to the beach. There were checkpoints. There were many checkpoints. On occasion, you would hear gunshots in the background. But for the most part, life was manageable. And this is during the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
You had power outages regularly, maybe 4 to 8 hours of electricity a day, maybe less. People had generators. Restaurants were open, cafes were open. People were using the lira. But I used to have these giant wads of lira. This is before the 500 was printed as a note. So the
Yes.
largest note was still the 250. And people
250.
250, and people would still use the 50 and the 100 as notes. So I do remember having wads of 50s and 100s and 250s. But you know what? I can't really find a major difference than 35 years ago than today.
Mm-hmm.
Hyperinflation, economy is unmanageable. There's really no state. There's no gunshots yet. This is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
There's no fighting in that sense, but the streets are dark at night. There's no money. People are still somehow managing. It's a dark chapter, but it's not that long ago Lebanon was in the same state. So I really think post-war conversations belong to Bosnia. They belong to Northern Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
They belong to countries that emerged from conflict and now are in a very fundamental different place. The Lebanon I know is one that cannot, for very specific reasons, cannot address basic issues. When you said trash and corruption and all the things that people are protesting about, things that decent people want to end, they don't want to live in this abnormal environment any longer. I think those well-earned rights, these basic services that Lebanese deserve today, they deserve it. They're not able to get the basics. And I think, I might be in the minority here, I think a root cause that stems from the Civil War is not being addressed. Otherwise, I see this as perpetual. You'll have waves of relative calm. You'll have the 1990s again. You'll have the 2000s. You'll have whatever we've had since 1989. And you'll also have distress. You'll have collapse. You'll have hunger. You'll have all of the above. And Samir Asir, going back to him, there's another quote that that's also on the ledge next to his statue.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's a quote in French, so I'm going to torture you with my French. Okay, this is going to sound horrible, so anyone who's listening, close. Beirut extravertie dans sa prospérité, la ville est encore dans sa ruine.
Mm-hmm.
Now, aside from me butchering that, it's basically it's a quote on a there's a duality.
Uh-huh.
There's a duality that lives in Beirut today. It's more on one side than the other right now, but it goes back and forth. It's a cycle. It starts off by saying Beirut is extraordinary. It's extroverted in its prosperity. And that is true. When things are fairly calm in Lebanon, when Beirut is relatively manageable, the city shines. And we have a lot to be proud of. A city that is outward in its wealth. And its wealth is in history, it's in culture, it's in many things. It's in the arts, it's in everything you would want in a country to celebrate, in its diversity, everything. But we are as extraordinary, as outward in our decay, in our ruins. We are able to do both quite well. I think his life mission was to break the cycle and stop falling apart every so often. And I read that quote as something that he also left us with, which is this book, which is everything he wrote about. Look at the reasons why this country is ungovernable right now. Don't be afraid to confront the biggest challenges. The challenge that cost him his life, the challenge that robbed us from his words, and we're not looking at it directly. And I part of the reason I focus in on this issue on the podcast is because I really, this is from humble perspective, my own limited means, it's my view, and I know maybe it's not a very popular one. Talk about the Civil War. Talk about the Civil War. Talk about the one group today that is still behaving like it's in the Civil War. Mm-hmm. Don't be shy about it. Actually, there's no reason to be shy, because that group is now not only keeping the regime intact, mm-hmm. It is also the most unscathed from what we've seen the last 30 years. So talk about it. Don't be shy. Don't be afraid to address that issue, and don't let the fear mongers convince you otherwise. And that's something I think is fundamental. Otherwise, I think we're going to be stuck for a long time in this cycle.
Yeah, that group is Hezbollah, obviously, and that I came to Hezbollah. So I'll share some background, which I think I haven't mentioned before. I actually don't remember, but I used to support Hezbollah. I used to be a supporter until it started dying out around 2008. I wouldn't say that my politics back then were terribly sophisticated, to be honest, but there was this instinctual thing.
When you're 17, you're allowed to have these. 17-year-olds are allowed to think whatever they want.
Oh man, I've met lots of much smarter 17-year-olds these days. But anyway, so there was this as my background, and that died out in the context of the Arab Spring, obviously. I supported the uprisings. In the beginning, Hezbollah supported some of them. It supported the one in Egypt, Tunisia, and even the one in Libya, which people tend to like to forget about today. Yeah. But of course, when it came to Syria, that's when the state of exception started. And at some point, at the beginning, I wasn't on board necessarily, as in like I wasn't denouncing them immediately. I wasn't. I was still undergrad. I finished my undergrad studies in 2013. But it's in 2013 and then 2014, especially 15. And this bit I have mentioned this before, that I started meeting lots of Syrian activists and Syrian groups. When I moved to London in 2015, that's when I met exiles and refugees. And then it became this retrospective thing. So by leaving, quote unquote, Lebanon temporarily, at least to do my studies, it's when I started seeing these things from a different framework, from a different view. And there was a stark contrast between the group that I thought I knew and the group that I ended up hearing about from the people who were experiencing it firsthand. And this is something that I feel even some of my best, like most well-meaning colleagues and friends and people who are activists on the left, not everyone, but a lot of them, too many, I would say. I think we're still in denial about the fact that there is something fundamentally different about this party. And even if they are of the mindset of not thinking about Lebanon, like even if they want to say all of the parties are equally bad, fine. That's one thing. Let's talk about this. Fine, let's talk about that. But there is one party and only one party that is in Syria. There's one party that constantly praises the Iranian regime. And this is something that it doesn't square with what are supposed to be our values. And for most of us, we know what happened in the 80s. We know who started assassinating the intellectuals of the South. We know these stories. And I mean, maybe not everyone knows these. More people should, for sure. And I mean, I'll plug in like the Ziad Majid episode does go into that. to different extent. But then what ended up happening is that for me, when October came around, and let's switch now a bit to the October uprising, because it's kind of like the elephant in the room. We didn't mention it as much now, but just I know that's just because I talk about it a lot on my podcast, and you do as well on yours.
Sure.
From the very first few days, when Nasrallah himself, I think it was like a Saturday or something, he came on and said like, this government is not gonna fall, this era is not gonna fall, whatnot. And then he ended up making like what, 5, 6, I don't know, speeches in one every other week. There was that period of time in the first 2, 3 weeks where basically all of them were talking. every other day someone was giving a speech. And I had this, I felt this weight in me that I knew this party so well right now, but not for Lebanon related reasons. I knew them so well because, well, by 2019, I was deeply embedded in Syrian activist circles, mostly in exile, some of them in Lebanon, but mostly in exile. Well, Lebanon technically would be in exile as well, I suppose. And I just had this sinking feeling that we were not talking about it as much as, and you can feel it. You could feel it on the streets. You could say Nabi Hibari's name. You could say Jabran Basir's name. You can say Michelin. You can say Samir Jaja. You can say Hariri. You can say Jumblat. I'm forgetting someone. You can say all of these big names. But as soon as you mention his name, as soon as you say Hassan Nasrallah, that's when you kind of feel, like you have to look around you. Yeah. And I saw it with my own eyes. I saw the activists chanting, and I saw them before they would end up saying his name in these chants, Yalla Irhal Mishran, Yalla Irhal Nasrallah, Yalla Irhal, and so on. You could feel it. The tension comes up, and now that everyone has to be on guard. And sometimes you have these moments of people bifishu khil'un, as we say, like they kind of let it all out, and that's when you feel the bravery come in a sense.
Yeah.
But that doesn't last long for the most part because it's so difficult. And as Ziad, and I'll let you comment and continue, but as Ziad mentioned, I think he mentioned it on both of mine and your episode podcast, that Hezbollah is basically the elephant in the room in Lebanon. And it's both a party that is extremely difficult to work with, but it's a party that at the same time we have to do something about. We have to understand. We have to tackle. I don't want the violent way, and I think it's not the right way, and we would definitely lose in any case. Mm-hmm. But I don't believe that is the way in any case, because I don't believe that the majority of people who belong to Hezbollah are necessarily bad people. Mm-hmm. But as in like the lower classes, let's say, not the people at the top. But at the same time, there has to be more bravery on our side. We have to say that even if you support the party, we have to talk about the politicians. We have to talk about the party's policies. We have to talk about the party's priorities. And this discussion is extremely difficult to have. I've tried it many times. I've tried it after being punched myself. I've seen others try it much more frequently than I have. I had given up at some point. And yet it should continue. I don't believe it's hopeless. I don't believe anything is ever hopeless. Although I know right now specifically it's a very odd thing to say given what's happening. So anyway, so I've been rambling on again, but go on.
No, on the contrary, these rambles are actually what gets me thinking. So I'm glad the rambling actually helps me sort of think a bit. And I mean, this is something that came across my mind because you mentioned you were born during one of the most violent chapters, the Civil War. The late 1980s was a very violent episode. Mm-hmm. And it, in a way, became so violent that you had Christian refugees coming into West Beirut, seeking mm-hmm. refuge. And this was an unusual thing for Ashrafi to turn to Hamra for life. Yes. So I can imagine 1989, maybe you're living, I don't know, somewhere in Kisrwan, and you want to speak your mind about Samir Jaja. Mm-hmm. I think you would think twice. You'd think maybe 20 times. You'd be so afraid you wouldn't want to say anything about Samir Jaja. Yeah. That's 1989. So you have a militiaman, a warlord, a man born out of civil war. He's Bashir Jmeya's protege. He runs a militia that runs part of Lebanon. This is a warlike leader. You're afraid of saying his name. No one is afraid of saying Samir Jaja's name today. Whether it's in Ibsharri, whether it's in Beirut, whether it's anywhere, from any corner of Lebanon, you can say Samir Jaja's name. Nobody is going to threaten you. And if they do, and it might happen, it's because probably you found those few people that are going to do it, and they're going to make your life miserable, but the numbers are small, and they're not the majority. It's because we don't think of Samir Jaja the way we did in 1989. Hassan Nasrallah today, we think of him the way we think of Jaja in 1989, or maybe Jumblat Bashouf in the 1980s, or Birri for that matter, in parts of Beirut. There's a fear. That's a civil war fear. And I'm going to maybe step back a bit. In 2000, actually let's go even earlier, in the 1990s, late 90s. It's something I've never really shared publicly, but 1999, early 2000, the Israelis are letting it be known that they're going to withdraw from the south.
Yeah.
It didn't happen just literally within hours. I mean, they were openly posturing at their withdrawal in the lead up to, I think it was in May of 2000, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Yeah, May. So right in May of 2000, right? Because we just had the 20-year anniversary.
Yeah.
But the months leading up to May, there were whispers about the Israelis pulling out. I was living at the embassy in Washington, Lebanese embassy in Washington D.C. My father was the ambassador at the time, and you probably enjoy this. The Syrian ambassador to Washington back then was Walid Ma'allim. He was the Syrian ambassador to Washington, and he would show up at the Lebanese embassy, and the Syrians were always trying to put people in the embassy. And it's not just Syrian regime figures, it was Lebanese working with the Syrians in Lebanon, trying to put friendly voices in the embassy, or if not friendly voices, let's say maybe their own type of intelligence, where they would know if the people in the embassy were doing things without their without their consent. The big problem back then for them was the Israelis were leaving.
Yeah.
They were afraid. They were really afraid that once the Israelis leave Lebanon, they would lose power over Lebanon. And in a way, if you think about it, this anti-Israel regime, this regime that champions Palestinian rights, or so they claim, this regime that is sort of the proud savior of all things Arab, this horrible group of thugs next door that brainwashed way too many of us into believing these things. They're the ones that are afraid when the Israelis leave, they'll lose their leverage in Lebanon.
Yeah.
And by leverage, it was really that Hezbollah, over time, would eventually fill in what they lost. Hezbollah would gain what the Syrians lost. And in a way, the Syrians were right. Their leverage would diminish. But by 2000, there's not one Syrian, there's not one Israeli soldier left in the south. There's not one Lebanese soldier in the south. There's not one Syrian soldier in the south. Instead, there's Hezbollah. Why would a state purposely prevent its own sovereign army from entering the south? It makes no sense. It doesn't add up, whatever the justification. The fact the Lebanese army did not set foot into the south until 2006 meant only that Hezbollah was beginning to take over the role the Syrians played in Lebanon. That's, I think, in those years, it became clearer and clearer that any sympathy one has for this group fighting Israelis in the south, or for that matter, anyone with maybe they would tolerate that kind of group because of the Israeli presence in the south and that proxy militia, the South Lebanese army in the south, that there was, in a way, some justification you could play with. Some, maybe. But by 2000, and obviously by 2006, it was clear that this group was not ready to join the rest of the groups in the post-war era. It was very clear. They would not tolerate that kind of transition that every other group played in Lebanon. And I'm not saying the other groups are good. It's not like the that's the model necessarily, but they were unwilling to help and contribute to rebuilding the state. On the contrary, it's the state will be left to do a few things, but we, Hezbollah, have very clear lines and their security of the country and their Lebanon's foreign policy. What happened since 2006, and now we're seeing it happen on the streets of Beirut, we're seeing it happen in politics of Lebanon, we're seeing it all over the country. They're now saving the regime. They've become that powerful. So I think one has to look at Hezbollah today, not in the sensitive, we can't criticize them because they helped liberate the South, or for that matter, Hassan Nasrallah is untouchable. You can't criticize him because he is too pure and too whatever. You can't have that in Lebanon. You cannot tolerate one group's determination to hijack a country's sovereignty and to play by civil war rules, and at the same time expect for decency and reform and accountability. That just doesn't add up. Northern Ireland, I think very few people will look to the IRA today as the answer for their problems. They tolerate Sinn Féin, the political evolution of the IRA. There's been no political evolution to Hezbollah. The sideshow that you referenced earlier, the few at the top that kind of do the politics that we know, they're as imperfect as any other Lebanese politician. They're as imperfect and they're as problematic. But it's not a party that evolved into that. That's just the sideshow. Hezbollah now secures regimes next door. If anything, it's one big reason why you still have the same regime next door.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I think the moment it becomes difficult to talk about that group and the power they wield in Lebanon, I think the revolution is lost. And that's my frustration really with people that maybe are inclined to only talk about economy and ignore them. Because if you ignore them, you'll have no economy. You really have nothing to work with. Yeah. That was my ramble, so I apologize for it.
No, I mean, I agree with that, of course. It is a very difficult thing to talk about. And it's even more difficult. I mean, listen, it's one thing for the both of us to say it's difficult, but it's even more difficult for very close friends who can't even be on my podcast, even though I've asked them many times, because they still live in the south, or they still live in Dahiya or in Dibaa, and they can be vocal online, usually anonymously, but they would not be comfortable talking about it or using their own voices because people would recognize them.
Yeah.
And this is not normal. This right there, just that in itself, is not normal. And I need my friends who I trust, and by here I'm using friends like in a as big of a tent as possible. People I admire and respect, and who I think anyway, like is vice versa, is reciprocal. I mean, to start thinking about this specific topic in a much broader sense. And the way I would do it, and this would be my advice, is look at it through a Syrian lens. Get out of the Lebanon box for a sec. I know it's very difficult for the Lebanese to do that. Very difficult to think about even our neighbors, even though like we basically have to. They're very powerful, historically anyway. Start looking at these stories, and there are many of them, very easy to find online. Syrians have been talking about this for 9 years now. This is a long time. With Hezbollah specifically, with 8 years, since 2012 more or less, and especially since 2013. Look at these stories, look at what they have to say, and try and square that with the party that is presenting itself in the Lebanese context, that is presenting itself to you, when it talks to you as the Lebanese. Compared to when, well, metaphorically, they don't actually talk to Syrians, but metaphorically, how they act towards anti-Assad Syrians, of course. And look at the contrast, because that for me is what really pushed me, in a sense, to be less hesitant and worried. I'm still worried a lot. I still sometimes mind my words. I have family in Dahiya, so I have to take these things into consideration. But for the most part, I say what's on my mind, and the reason why that happened is just Syrian activists who, because when I started comparing and contrasting what they have had to go through with what I have had to go through, which is relatively nothing. That's when like I kind of got their bravery in a sense, rather than just developing my own. So this is what I would recommend, really. I am very, very frustrated, and I know that you already know this. I'm continuously and perpetually frustrated by how little most Lebanese engage with Syria, as just from an activist perspective. There are lots of missed opportunities since 2011, in my opinion. But perhaps that's a discussion for another time. What I wanted to semi-end on, this can be a slow ending, but what would, besides the sovereignty issue, which, we've talked about this, and I don't think there's more to say on that. How would you see Lebanon, or no, let me ask it in a different way. The ongoing crisis in Lebanon is very, very difficult to think about, and I'm sure even much more difficult to actually experience, as in if I was physically in Lebanon. I'm still experiencing it, and so are you, in the sense that we have family and friends back home, of course.
Sure.
But, the different calculations are made, in a sense. What do you do with that reality, you personally? It doesn't have to be a perfect answer. How do you deal with that reality yourself?
I'll start with the maybe the heavier end of the answer, and then I'll move to the lighter.
Okay.
The last 24 hours, I think, are indicative of what to expect, so long as we have the same situation. When I look at the maybe the suggestions that Hariri will return, or that someone close to him will be brought in, I see two options. It's either somebody like Hassan Diab, who's more in line with what maybe Hezbollah would want in Lebanon, or Saad Hariri, who's nominally less in line, but at best serves as a hostage, and at worst plays the dirty game that we don't want to play any longer in Lebanon. Both options are bad. And I still believe the Kullun Yani Kullun slogan is at the core of any discussion, that there should be no preference to a Hariri who's brought back, as if October 16 is the goal and that we're going to go back to where we were in October 16. No one in their right mind would want that. That's what October 17 was all about. So that's my immediate frustration, is seeing a good chance that October 16 is now the goal for the regime. That's the more pressing, maybe the more disappointing thing, is that what exactly are the last 8 months about? The other stuff, the lira, I mean, is it 10,000 today? It's upwards.
9,000, almost 10.
It's 9,000. I mean, people. Aside from the horrible images that we see online, on TV and whatever, even private conversations with friends, and the maybe the deep disillusionment and this kind of despair. It really, I mean, I don't want to encourage anyone to leave Lebanon, but at the same time, I can't blame anyone who's able to leave and can't sort of make them feel that they should stay for any reason. It would be unfair to say, no, you just wait it out, because there's not, in the short term, I don't think anything positive will emerge. And I say this, I know it's maybe tunnel vision, maybe it's too depressing, but I don't think the big challenges are being tackled. So I cannot see a positive change. And if any positive change happens, it's because the regime is maybe offering October 16. That is not the goal. So on a lighter note, I try, like you're doing, like people that I admire, and you're one of them. I try to document whatever I can among voices that either I admire or I've grown to admire, people that supported this revolution and still support it, and they support it for all the reasons we discussed. I try to capture their voices and lock it. And maybe this is a way of doing two things. On a private capacity, I'm trying to share my father's words and maybe his reflections, and trying to project what he'd be saying, what he'd be doing right now. So I try to keep him alive in that sense. And I also try to keep alive the thoughts, the passions, the hope, and all the euphoria that both of us witnessed. I try to preserve that. And maybe, if it's not this round, maybe next time. And if it's not next time, who knows when it'll happen. One day, Lebanon will be a better place. One day. And I hope that these discussions, these conversations may offer something. Maybe the things that we got right, and probably more importantly, the things we got wrong. And especially always keeping voices that we lost, keeping them alive. Samir Asir is one of them. He enters the podcast regularly. He's actually, I owe the tour to him. I owe storytelling, I think, in large part to him. And what better man to celebrate than Samir Asir? So I hope that answers that question.
It does. Ronnie, thank you a lot for your time.
Habibi Joey, thank you.